All right, let's get into one of the most well-documented and, fiercely debated cases of alleged demonic possession in English history. We're going to rewind all the way back to 1778 to unpack the really strange and controversial story of a man named George Lukins. It's a case that basically pitted faith against reason in a huge public showdown.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll meet the man at the very center of this storm, George Lukins himself. Then, we're going to look at the public ritual that was supposed to save him. After that, we'll explore the war of words that broke out in pamphlets and newspapers, dig into the central debate, and finally, take a look at the whole case through a modern lens.
Okay, so before he got the nickname the Yatton Daemoniac, who was this guy, George Lukins? To really get what happened, you've got to understand the man himself.
Well, Lukins was a tailor from the village of Yatton, and by all accounts, people thought he had an extraordinary good character. But around 1770, his life just took this incredibly bizarre turn. He was performing in a Christmas play when he claimed he got hit by a supernatural slap, something that just knocked him out cold. And from that day on, for almost 20 years, he was plagued by these violent, totally inexplicable fits.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. This wasn't just some local superstition. Lukins actually went to get the best medical help he could find. He spent 20 weeks at St. George's Hospital in London, a top-tier institution for the time. And after all that, the best doctors in the country were completely stumped. They couldn't figure it out, they couldn't treat him. So they sent him home and officially pronounced his condition incurable. And for a lot of people, that failure of science was all the proof they needed that the cause wasn't natural at all.
So, with medicine officially throwing in the towel, the stage was set for a completely different kind of intervention. And this brings us right to the main event, a really dramatic public deliverance ritual at Temple Church in Bristol.
For 18 long years, Lukins' condition just kept getting worse. He even came to believe he was possessed by 7 demons, and that only 7 clergymen praying together could free him. In May of 1788, his story finally reached a Reverend Joseph Easterbrook. A letter about the case got published in the local paper, and suddenly this private struggle became a huge public deal, all leading up to a gathering on, of all days, Friday, June 13th.
The accounts from people who were actually there, they're pretty startling. They wrote that Lukins was having these violent convulsions, that his face was contorting into horrible shapes, and that he was making sounds like a dog barking. They said he spoke and sang in different voices, one deep and male, another high and female. He'd recoil from holy words, and maybe most disturbing of all, he apparently sang a twisted version of a famous hymn, the Te Deum, but changed it into a song praising the devil.
At one point during the ceremony, one of the clergymen demanded to know who was speaking through Lukins. The response, which shows up in multiple accounts, was chilling. A deep voice supposedly boomed out, "I am the devil. I will never quit my hold of him." You can imagine, for the people in that room, this wasn't an act. This was terrifying, undeniable proof of a real, demonic presence.
So this ritual goes on for nearly 2 hours. The clergymen are praying, they're commanding the spirits to leave, and then, just like that, it was over. The convulsions stopped, the strange voices went silent, and George Lukins, in his own normal voice, cried out, "Blessed Jesus." He then apparently got up, knelt down, calmly recited the Lord's Prayer, and thanked everyone for saving him.
Now you'd think that would be the end of the story, right? But oh no, it was just getting started. This was the Age of Enlightenment, and a public miracle like this just lit a fire under the public. A massive debate erupted, not in the church but in the newspapers. Was this a genuine act of God? Or was it just a really elaborate hoax?
The first shot fired in this media war came from the people who supported the exorcism. They gathered up all the eyewitness accounts and published this pamphlet called A Narrative of the Extraordinary Case of George Lukins. This was their version of events, a straightforward, faith-affirming story of a good man saved from evil and proof that God's power was still at work.
But it didn't take long for a rebuttal to hit the streets. It came from a surgeon named Samuel Norman, who actually knew Lukins. He published his own take, arguing the whole thing was a fraud. Norman claimed Lukins was just a really talented ventriloquist and mimic who used his performance skills to fool a bunch of gullible clergymen. And just like that, you have 2 completely opposite stories fighting it out for the public's belief.
So, let's really dig into that central debate, because it all comes down to how you interpret the exact same facts. And man, does this case perfectly capture the clash between 2 worldviews that were really going at it in the 18th century.
Just look at how each side framed the evidence. The fact that top doctors called him incurable. For believers, that was clear proof the cause was supernatural. For skeptics, it just meant he was a great actor who could even fool doctors. Those multiple voices? Well, that's either 7 demons speaking, or it's a gifted ventriloquist. The violent fits? Demonic torment on one hand, or maybe a mix of epilepsy and just faking it for attention on the other. And that instant cure? A divine miracle? Or just the grand finale to an 18-year-long performance?
The skeptics back then basically had 2 explanations. It was either a known illness like epilepsy, or Lukens was a really clever con man. Today, of course, we have a much bigger toolbox to explain these kinds of behaviors. Modern psychiatry might point to things like dissociative identity disorder, Tourette's, schizophrenia, or conversion disorder. All things that could have symptoms that, to people back then, would have looked a whole lot like possession.
And that brings us to a really fascinating thought experiment. How would a case like George Lukins be handled if it happened right now, today?
Well, the response would be completely different, that's for sure. Step 1 would be an immediate and thorough medical workup. Psychiatric and neurological tests, the whole shebang. Any church involvement, what they often call deliverance ministry now, would be handled with extreme care, almost certainly kept private, and only considered after every medical possibility was ruled out. You'd also have legal questions, and let's be honest, an absolute media frenzy that would make the Bristol Gazette look like a tiny village newsletter.
So, when you boil it all down, the case of George Lukens is so much more than just a spooky historical story. It's really a mirror, reflecting how we try to understand human suffering. The labels we use definitely change. What they called a demon, we might call it disorder. But it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What truths, what complexities might our own modern labels be hiding from us today?